Chapter 11. Lawrence could not help wincing at the haphazard way in which Jane threw her things out of the wardrobe and into heaps upon the bed. "May I help you?" he asked finally, out of desperation, and took possession of her baggage. "No, I beg you, permit me the liberty. You may consider your flight path as I do this," he said.
"Thank you, Lawrence. That is very kind of you."
She sat down with her maps instead.
"It will be a straightforward flight, I hope," she went on,
scribbling calculations and moving the small bits of wood which she was using to represent the scattered dragon transport ships that would provide Excidium and his formation with the resting places on their way to Cadiz.
"So long as the weather holds, less than 2 weeks should see us there."
With so much urgent need, the dragons would not be going by a single transport, but rather would fly from one transport to another, attempting to predict their locations based on the current and the wind. Lawrence nodded, though a little grimly. They were only a day shy of October, and there was every likelihood at this time of year that the weather would not hold. Then she would be faced with the dangerous choice of trying to find a transport that might easily have been blown off course, or seeking shelter inland in the face of Spanish artillery, presuming, of course, that the formation was not itself brought down by a storm. Dragons were from time to time cast down by lightning or heavy winds, and if flung into a heavy ocean they could easily drown with all their crew. But there was no choice. Lily had recovered with great speed over the intervening weeks. She had led the formation through a full patrol only yesterday and landed without pain or stiffness. Lenton had looked her over, spoken a few words with her and Captain Harcourt, and gone straight away to give Jane her orders for Cadiz. Lawrence had been expecting as much, of course, but he could not help feeling concern, both for the dragons going and for those remaining behind.
"There, that will do," she said, finishing her chart and throwing down her pen.
He looked up from the baggage in surprise. He had fallen into a brown study and packed mechanically, without marking what he did. Now he realized that he had been silent for nearly 20 minutes together, and that he had one of her stays in his hands. He hastily dropped it atop the neatly packed things in her small case and closed the lid. The sunlight was beginning to come in at the window. Their time was gone.
"There, Lawrence, do not look so glum. I have made the flight to Gibraltar 12 times, she said, coming to kiss him soundly. "You will have a worse time of it here, I am afraid. They will undoubtedly try some mischief once they know we are gone."
"I have every confidence in you," Lawrence said, ringing the bell for the servants. "I only hope we have not misjudged." It was as much as he would say critical of Lenton, particularly on a subject where he could not be unbiased. Yet he felt that even if he had not had a personal objection to make to placing Excidium and his formation in danger, he would still have been concerned by the lack of further intelligence. Volley had arrived 3 days before with a report full of fresh negatives. A handful of French dragons had arrived in Cadiz, enough to keep Mortiferous from forcing out the fleet, but not a tenth of the dragons which had been stationed along the Rhine. And in cause for more concern, even though nearly every light and quick dragon not wholly involved in dispatch service had been pressed into scouting and spying, they still knew nothing more of Bonaparte's work across the Channel. He walked with her to Excidium's clearing and saw her aboard. It was strange, for he felt as though he ought to feel more. He would have put a bullet in his brains sooner than let Edith go to face danger while he remained behind himself, yet he could say his adieus to Roland without much more of a pang than in bidding farewell to any other comrade. She blew him a friendly kiss from atop Excidium's back, once her crew were all aboard. "I will see you in a few months, I'm sure, or sooner if we can chase the frogs out of harbour," she called down. "Fair winds, and mind you don't let Emily run wild." He raised a hand to her. "Godspeed," he called, and stood watching as the enormous wings carried Excidium up, the other dragons of his formation rising to join him, until they had all dwindled out of sight to the south. Although they kept a wary eye on the Channel skies, the first weeks after Excidium's departure were quiet. No raids came, and Lenton was of the opinion that the French still thought Excidium was in residence, and were correspondingly reluctant to make any venture. "The longer we can keep them thinking it, the better," he said to the assembled captains after another uneventful patrol. "Aside from the benefit to us, just as well if they don't realize another formation is nearing their precious fleet at Cadiz." They all took a great measure of comfort from the news of Excidium's safe arrival, which Volley brought almost 2 weeks to the day from his departure. "They'd already begun when I left," Captain James told the other captains the next day, taking a hurried breakfast before setting out on his return journey. "You could hear the Spaniards howling for miles. Their merchantmen are as quick to fall apart under dragon spray as any ship of the line, and their shops and houses as well. I expect they'll fire on the Frenchmen themselves if Villeneuve doesn't come out soon, alliance or not." The atmosphere grew lighter after this encouraging news, and Lenton cut their patrol a little short and granted them all liberty for celebration, a welcome respite to men who had been working at a frenetic pace. The more energetic went into town, most seized a little sleep, as did the weary dragons. Lawrence took the opportunity to enjoy a quiet evening's reading with Temeraire. They stayed together late into the night, reading by the light of the lanterns. Lawrence woke out of a light doze some time after the moon had risen. Temeraire's head was dark against the illuminated sky, and he was looking searchingly to the north of their clearing. "Is something the matter?" Lawrence asked him. Sitting up, he could hear a faint noise, strange and high. Even as they listened, the sound stopped. "Lawrence, that was Lily, I think," Temeraire said, his ruff standing up stiffly. Lawrence slid down at once. "Stay here. I will return as quickly as I may," he said, and Temeraire nodded without ever looking away. The paths through the covert were largely deserted and unlit. Excidium's formation gone, all the light dragons out on scouting duty, and the night cold enough to send even the most dedicated crews into the barracks buildings. The ground had frozen 3 days before. It was packed and hard enough for his heels to drum hollowly upon it as he walked. Lily's clearing was empty. A faint murmur of noise from the barracks, whose lit windows he could see distantly through the trees, and no one about the buildings. Lily herself was crouched, motionless, her yellow eyes red-rimmed and staring, and she was clawing the ground silently. Low voices, and the sound of crying. Lawrence wondered if he was intruding untimely, but Lily's evident distress decided him. He walked into the clearing, calling in a strong voice, "Harcourt, are you there?" "No further," came Choiseul's voice, low and sharp. Lawrence came around Lily's head and halted in dreadful surprise. Choiseul was holding Harcourt by the arm, and there was an expression of complete despair on his face. "Make no sound, Lawrence," he said. There was a sword in his hand, and behind him on the ground Lawrence could see a young midwingman stretched out, dark blood stains spreading over the back of his coat. "No sound at all." "For God's sake, what do you think you are about?" Lawrence said. "Harcourt, is it well with you?" "He has killed Will Poise," she said thickly. She was wavering where she stood, and as the torchlight came on her face, he could see a bruise already darkening across half her forehead. "Lawrence, never mind about me. You must go and fetch help. He means to do Lily a mischief." "No, never, never," Choiseul said. "I mean no harm to her or you, Catherine, I swear it. But I will not be answerable if you interfere, Lawrence. Do nothing." He raised the sword. Blood gleamed on its edge not far from Harcourt's neck, and Lily made the thin, eerie noise again, a high-pitched whining that grated against the ear. Choiseul was pale, his face taking on a greenish cast in the light, and he looked desperate enough to do anything. Lawrence kept his position, hoping for a better moment. Choiseul stood, staring at him a moment longer, until satisfied Lawrence did not mean to go, and then said, "We will go all of us together to Precursoris. Lily, you will stay here, and follow when you see us go aloft. I promise you no harm will come to Catherine so long as you obey." "Oh, you miserable, cow-hearted traitor dog," Harcourt said. "Do you think I am going to go to France with you and lick Bonaparte's boots? How long have you been planning this?" She struggled to pull away from him, even staggering as she was, but Choiseul shook her and she nearly fell. Lily snarled, half rising, her wings mantling. Lawrence could see the black acid glistening at the edges of her bone spurs. "Catherine!" she hissed, the sound distorted through her clenched teeth. "Silence! Enough!" Choiseul said, pulling Harcourt up and close to his body, pinning her arms. The sword still held steady in his other hand, Lawrence's eyes always upon it, waiting for a chance. "You will follow Lily. You will do as I have said. We are going now. March, at once, monsieur, there." He gestured with the sword. Lawrence did not turn around, but stepped backwards, and once beneath the shadow of the trees he moved more slowly still, so that Choiseul came unknowingly closer than he meant to do. A moment of wild grappling, then they all three went to the ground in a heap, the sword flying and Harcourt caught between them. They struck the ground heavily, but Choiseul was beneath, and for a moment Lawrence had the advantage. He was forced to sacrifice it, to roll Harcourt free and out of harm's way, and Choiseul struck him across the face as soon as she was clear, throwing him off. They rolled about on the ground, battering at each other awkwardly, both trying to reach for the sword even as they struggled. Choiseul was powerfully built and taller, and though Lawrence had a far greater experience of close combat, the Frenchman's weight began to tell as they wrestled. Lily was roaring out loud now, voices calling in the distance, and despair gave Choiseul a burst of strength. He drove a fist into Lawrence's stomach and lunged for the sword while Lawrence curled, gasping about the pain. Then there was a tremendous roaring above them. The ground shuddered, branches tumbling down in a rain of dry leaves and pine needles, and an immense old tree was wrenched whole out of the ground beside them. Temeraire was above them, beating wildly as he tore away the cover. More bellowing, now from Precursoris. The French dragon's pale, marbled wings were visible in the dark, approaching, and Temeraire writhed around to face him, claws stretching out. Lawrence dragged himself up and threw himself onto Choiseul, bearing him down to the ground with all his weight. He was retching even as they struggled, but Temeraire's danger spurred him on. Choiseul managed to turn them over and force an arm against Lawrence's throat, pressing hard, choking. Lawrence caught only a glimpse of motion, and then Choiseul went limp. Harcourt had fetched an iron bar from Lily's gear and struck him upon the back of the head. She was nearly fainting with the effort, Lily trying to crowd between the trees to reach her. The crew were rushing into the clearing now at last, however, and many hands helped Lawrence up to his feet. "Stand over that man there. Bring torches," Lawrence said, gasping. "And get a full-voiced man here with a speaking trumpet. Hurry, damn you!" For above, Temeraire and Precursoris were still circling each other, claws flashing. Harcourt's first lieutenant was a big-chested man with a voice that needed no trumpet. As soon as he understood the circumstances, he cupped his hands around his mouth and bellowed up at Precursoris. The big French dragon broke off and flew in wild, desperate circles for a moment as he peered down to where Choiseul was being secured, and then with drooping head he returned to the ground, Temeraire hovering watchfully until he had landed. Maximus was housed not far off, and Berkeley had come to the clearing on hearing the noise. He took charge now, setting men to chain Precursoris and others to bear Harcourt and Choiseul to the surgeons, still others to take away poor Wilpoys to be buried. "No, thank you. I can manage," Lawrence said, shaking off the willing hands that would have carried him as well. His breathing was returning, and he walked slowly over to the clearing where Temeraire had landed beside Lily, to comfort both the dragons and try to calm them. Choiseul did not rouse for the better part of a day, and when he first woke he was thick-tongued and confused in his speech. Yet by the next morning he was once again in command of himself, and at first refused to answer any questions whatsoever. Precursoris had been ringed round by all the other dragons, and ordered to remain on the ground under pain of Choiseul's death. A threat to the handler was the one thing which could hold an unwilling dragon, and the means by which Choiseul had intended to force Lily to defect to France were now used against him. Precursoris made no attempt to defy the command, but huddled into a miserable heap beneath his chains, eating nothing and occasionally keening softly. "Harcourt," Lenton said at last, coming into the dining room and finding them all assembled and waiting. "I am damned sorry, but I must ask you to try. He has not spoken to anyone else, but if he has the honour of a yellow rat, he must feel some explanation owed you. Will you ask him?" She nodded, and then she drained her glass, but her face stayed so very pale that Lawrence asked quietly, "Should you like me to accompany you?" "Yes, if you please," she said at once, gratefully, and he followed her to the small, dark cell where Choiseul was incarcerated. Choiseul could not meet her gaze, nor speak to her. He shook his head and shuddered, and even wept as she asked him questions in an unsteady voice. "Oh, damn you!" she cried at last, crackling with anger.
How could you have a heart to do this? Every word you have said to me was a lie. Tell me, did you even arrange that first ambush on our way here? Tell me!" Her voice was breaking, and he had dropped his face into his hands. Now he raised it and cried to Lawrence, "For God's sake, make her go! I will tell you anything you like, only send her out," and dropped it back down again. Lawrence did not in the least want to be his interrogator, but he could not prolong Harcourt's suffering unnecessarily. He touched her on the shoulder, and she fled at once. It was deeply unpleasant to have to ask Choiseul questions, still more unpleasant to hear that he had been a traitor since coming from Austria. "I see what you think of me," Choiseul added, noting the look of disgust on Lawrence's face. "And you have a right. But for me there was no choice." Lawrence had been keeping himself strictly to questions, but this paltry attempt at excuse inflamed him beyond his resistance. With contempt he said, "You might have chosen to be honest, and done your duty in the place you begged of us." Choiseul laughed, with no mirth in the sound. "Indeed. And when Bonaparte is in London this Christmas time, what then? You may look at me that way if you like. I have no doubt of it. And I assure you, if I thought any deed of mine could alter that outcome, I would have acted. Instead, you have become a traitor twice over and helped him, when your first betrayal could only be excused if you had been sincere in your principles," Lawrence said. He was disturbed by Choiseul's certainty, though he would never conceive of giving any sign as much. "Ah, principles," Choiseul said. All his bravado had deserted him, and he seemed now only weary and resigned. "France is not so under strength as are you, and Bonaparte has executed dragons for treason before. What do principles matter to me when I see the shadow of the guillotine hanging upon Precursoris? And where was I to take him? To Russia? He will outlive me by 2 centuries, and you must know how they treat dragons there. I could hardly fly him to America without a transport. My only hope was a pardon, and Bonaparte offered it only at a price." "By which you mean Lily," Lawrence said coldly. Surprisingly, Choiseul shook his head. "No, his price was not Catherine's dragon, but yours." At the blank look upon Lawrence's face, he added, "The Chinese egg was sent as a gift for him from the imperial throne. He meant me to retrieve it. He did not know Temeraire was already hatched." Choiseul shrugged and spread his hands. "I thought perhaps if I killed him—" Lawrence struck him full across the face, with such force as to knock him onto the stone floor of the cell. His chair rocked and fell over with a clatter. Choiseul coughed and blotted blood from his lip, and the guard opened the door and looked inside. "Everything all right, sir?" he asked, looking straight at Lawrence. He paid not the slightest mind to Choiseul's injury. "Yes, you may go," Lawrence said flatly, wiping blood from his hand onto his handkerchief as the door closed once again. He would ordinarily have been ashamed to strike a prisoner, but in this moment he felt not the slightest qualm. His heart was still beating very quickly. Choiseul slowly set his chair back upright and sat down once more. More quietly he said, "I am sorry. I could not bring myself to it in the end, and I thought instead—" He stopped, seeing the colour rise again in Lawrence's face. The very notion that for all these months such malice had been lurking so close to Temeraire, averted only by some momentary quirk of conscience on Choiseul's part, was enough to make his blood run cold. With loathing he said, "And so instead you tried to seduce a girl barely past her schoolroom years and abduct her." Choiseul said nothing. Indeed, Lawrence could hardly imagine what defence he could have offered. After a moment's pause, Lawrence added, "You can have no further pretensions to honour. Tell me what Bonaparte plans, and perhaps Lenton will have Precursoris sent to the breeding grounds in Newfoundland, if indeed your motive is for his life and not your own miserable hide." Choiseul paled, but said, "I know very little, but what I know I will tell you, if he gives his word to do as much." "No," Lawrence said. "You may speak, and hope for a mercy you do not deserve if you choose. I will not bargain with you." Choiseul bowed his head, and when he spoke he was broken, so faint Lawrence had to strain to hear him.
I do not know what he intends, precisely. But he desires me to urge the weakening of the covert here most particularly, to have as many sent south to the Mediterranean as could be arranged.
Lawrence felt sick with dismay. This goal at least had been brilliantly accomplished.
Does he have some means for his fleet to escape Cadiz? He demanded. Does he suppose he can bring them here without facing Nelson? Do you imagine Bonaparte confided in me? Choiseul said, not lifting his head. To him also I was a traitor. I was told the tasks I was to accomplish. Nothing more.
Lawrence satisfied himself with a few more questions that Choiseul truly knew nothing else. He left the room feeling both soiled and alarmed, and went at once to Lenton. The news cast a heavy pall upon the whole covert. The captains had not broadcast the details, but even the lowliest cadet or crewman could tell that a shadow lay upon them. Choiseul had timed his attempt well. The dispatch rider would not reach them again for 6 days, and from there 2 weeks or more would be required to see any portion of the forces from the Mediterranean restored to the Channel. Militia forces and several army detachments had already been sent for. They would arrive within a few days to begin emplacing additional artillery along the coastline. Lawrence, with additional cause for anxiety, had spoken to Granby and Hollin to raise their caution on Temeraire's behalf. If Bonaparte were jealous enough of having so personal a prize taken away, he might well send another agent, this one more willing to slay the dragon he could no longer claim. "You must promise me to be careful," he told Temeraire as well. "Eat nothing unless one of us is by and has approved it. And if anyone whom I have not presented to you seeks to approach you, do not under any circumstances permit it, even if you must fly to another clearing." "I will have a care, Lawrence, I promise," said Temeraire. "I do not understand, though, why the French Emperor should want to have me killed. How could that improve his circumstances? He would do better to ask them for another egg." "My dear, the Chinese would hardly condescend to give him a second where the first went so badly astray while in the keeping of his own men," he said. "I am still puzzled at their having given him even one, indeed. He must have some prodigiously gifted diplomat at their court. And I suppose his pride may be hurt to think that a lowly British captain stands in the place which he had meant to occupy himself." Temeraire snorted with disdain. "I am sure I would never have liked him in the least, even if I had hatched in France," he said. "He sounds a very unpleasant person." "Oh, I cannot truly say. One hears a great deal of his pride, but there is no denying that he is a very great man, even if he is a tyrant," Lawrence said reluctantly. He would have been a great deal happier to be able to convince himself that Bonaparte was a fool. Lenton gave orders that patrols now were to be flown only by half the formation at a time, the rest kept back at the covert for intensive combat training. Under cover of night, several additional dragons were secretly flown down from the coverts at Edinburgh and Inverness, including Victoriatus, the Parnassian whom they had rescued what now seemed a long time ago. His captain, Richard Clark, made a nice point of coming to greet Lawrence and Temeraire. "I hope you can forgive me for not paying you my respects and my gratitude sooner," he said. "I confess, at Lagan I had very little thought for anything but his recovery, and we were shipped out again without warning, as I believe were you." Lawrence shook his hand heartily. "Pray do not give it a thought," he said. "I hope he is wholly recovered?" "Entirely, thank heaven. And none too soon either," Clark said grimly. "I understand the assault is expected at any moment." And yet the days stretched out, painfully long with anticipation, and no attack came. 3 more Winchesters were brought down for additional scouting, but one and all they returned from their dangerous forays to the French shores to report heavy patrols at all hours along the enemy's coastline. There was no chance of penetrating far enough inland to acquire more information. Levitas was among them, but the company was large enough that Lawrence was not obliged to see much of Rankin, for which he was grateful. He tried not to see the signs of that neglect which he could do no more to cure. He felt he could not visit the little dragon further without provoking a quarrel which might be disastrous to the temper of the whole covert. However, he compromised with his conscience so far as to say nothing when he saw Hollin coming to Temeraire's clearing very early the next morning with a bucket full of dirty cleaning rags and a guilty expression.
A great coldness settled over the camp as night came on Sunday, the first week of waiting gone. Volatilus had not arrived as expected. The weather had been clear, certainly no cause for delay. It stayed so for 2 further days, and then a third. Still he did not come. Lawrence tried not to look to the skies, and ignored his men doing the same, until that night he found Emily crying quietly outside the clearing, having crept away from the barracks for a little privacy. She was very ashamed to be caught at it, and pretended there was only some dust in her eyes. Lawrence took her to his rooms and had some cocoa brought. He told her, "I was 2 years older than you are now when I first went to sea, and I blubbered at night for a week." She looked so very sceptical at this account that a laugh was drawn from him. "No, I'm not inventing this for your benefit," he said. "When you are a captain and find one of your own cadets in similar circumstances, I imagine you will tell them what I have just told you."
"I'm not really afraid," she said, weariness and cocoa having combined to make her drowsy and unguarded. "I know Excidium will never let anything happen to Mother, and he is the finest dragon in all Europe." She woke up at having made this slip, and added anxiously, "Temeraire is very nearly as good, of course." Lawrence nodded gravely.
"Temeraire is a great deal younger. Perhaps he will equal Excidium some day, when he has more experience."
"Yes, just so," she said, very relieved, and he concealed his smile. 5 minutes later she was asleep. He laid her on the bed and went to sleep with Temeraire.
"Lawrence! Lawrence!" He stirred and blinked upwards. Temeraire was nudging him awake urgently, though the sky was still dark. Lawrence was dimly aware of a low, roaring noise, a crowd of voices, and then the crack of gunfire. He started up at once. None of his crew were in the clearing, nor his officers. "What is it?" Temeraire asked, rising to his feet and unfurling his wings as Lawrence climbed down. "Are we being attacked? I do not see any dragons aloft." "Sir, sir!" Morgan came running into the clearing, nearly falling over himself in his haste and eagerness. "Volley is here, sir, and there has been a great battle, and Napoleon is killed." "Oh, does that mean the war is over already?" Temeraire asked, disappointed. "I've not even been in any real battles yet." "Perhaps the news may have grown in the telling. I shall be surprised to learn that Bonaparte is truly dead," Lawrence said. But he had identified the noise as cheering, and certainly some good news had arrived, if not of quite such an absurd calibre. "Morgan, go and rouse Mr. Hollin and the ground crew with my apologies for the hour, and ask them to bring Temeraire his breakfast. My dear," he said, turning to Temeraire, "I will go and learn what I can, and return with the news soonest." "Yes, please, and do hurry," Temeraire said urgently, rearing up on his back legs to see above the trees what might be in progress. The headquarters was blazing with light. Volley was sitting on the parade grounds before the building, tearing ravenously into a sheep, a couple of groundsmen with the dispatch service keeping off the growing crowd of men streaming from the barracks. Several of the young army and militia officers were firing off their guns in their excitement, and Lawrence was forced to nearly push his way through to reach the doors. The doors to Lenton's office were closed, but Captain James was sitting in the officers' club, eating with scarcely less ferocity than his dragon, and already all the other captains were with him, having the news. "Nelson told me to wait, said they'd come out of port before I had time to make another circuit," James was saying out of the corner of his mouth and somewhat muffled by toast, while Sutton attempted to sketch the scene on a piece of paper. "I hardly believed him, but sure enough, by Sunday morning out they came, and we met them off Cape Trafalgar early on Monday." He swallowed down a cup of coffee, all the company waiting impatiently for him to finish, and pushed his plate aside for a moment to take the paper from Sutton. "Here, let me," he said, drawing little circles to mark the positions of the ships. 27 and 12 dragons of ours against 33 and 10. "2 columns, breaking their line twice?" Lawrence asked, studying the diagram with satisfaction. Just the sort of strategy to throw the French into disarray, from which their ill-trained crews could hardly have recovered. "What? Oh, the ships, yes, with Excidium and Laetificat over the weather column, Mortiferous over the lee," James said. "It was hot work at the head of the division, I can tell you. I couldn't see so much as a spar from above for the clouds of smoke. At one time I thought for sure victory had blown up. The Spanish had one of those blasted little Flecha del Fuegos over there, dashing about quicker than our guns could answer. He had all her sails on fire before Laetificat sent him running with his tail between his legs." "What were our losses?" Warren asked. his quiet voice cutting through the high spirits of their excitement. James shook his head. "It was a proper bloodbath, and no mistake," he said somberly. "I suppose we have near 1,000 men killed, and poor Nelson himself came in a hair's breadth of it. The fire-breather set alight one of Victory's sails, and it came down upon him where he stood on the quarter-deck. A couple of quick-thinking fellows doused him with the scuttlebutt, but they say his medals were melted to his skin, and he will wear them all the time now." 1,000 men. God rest their souls, Warren said. Conversation ceased, and when finally resumed it was at first subdued. But excitement, joy, gradually overcame what perhaps were the more proper sentiments of the moment. "I hope you will excuse me, gentlemen," Lawrence said, nearly shouting as the noise climbed to a fresh pitch. It precluded any chance of acquiring further intelligence for the moment. "I promised Temeraire to return at once. James, I suppose that the report of Bonaparte's demise is a false one?" "Yes, more's the pity, unless he falls down in an apoplexy over the news," James called back, which roused a general shout of laughter that continued by natural progression into a round of hearts of oak, and the singing followed Lawrence out the door and even through the covert, as the song was taken up by the men outside. By the time the sun rose, the covert was half empty. Scarcely a man had slept. The prevailing mood could not help but be joyful almost to the point of hysteria, as nerves which had been drawn to their limits abruptly relaxed. Lenton did not even attempt to call the men to order, and looked the other way as they poured out of the covert into the city to carry the news to those who had not yet heard, and mingle their voices into the general rejoicing. "Whatever scheme of invasion Bonaparte has been working towards, this must surely have put paid to it," Chenery said exultantly later that evening, as they stood together on the balcony and watched the returning crowd still milling more slowly about in the parade grounds below. All the men thoroughly drunk, but too happy for quarrelling, snatches of song bursting out occasionally to float up towards them. "How I should like to see his face!" "I think we have been giving him too much credit," Lenton said. His cheeks were red with port and satisfaction, as well they might be. His judgment to send Excidium had proven sound and contributed materially to the victory. "I think it clear he does not understand the navy so well as the army and the aerial corps. An uninformed man might well imagine that 33 ships of the line had no excuse to lose so thoroughly to 27. "But how can it have taken his aerial divisions so long to reach them?" Harcourt said. "Only 10 dragons. And from what James said, more than half of those Spanish. That is not a tenth of the strength he had in Austria. Perhaps he has not moved them from the Rhine after all. I have heard the passes over the Pyrenees are damned difficult, though I have never tried them myself," Chenery said. "But I dare say he never sent them, thinking Villeneuve had what forces he needed. And they have all been lolling about in covert and getting fat. No doubt he's been thinking all this time that Villeneuve would sail straight through Nelson, perhaps losing 1 or 2 ships in the process, expecting them daily and wondering where they were, and we here biting our nails meanwhile for no good reason." "And now his army cannot come across," Harcourt said. "Quoth Lord St. Vincent, I don't say they cannot come, but they cannot come by sea," Chenery said, grinning. "And if Bonaparte thinks to take Britain with 40 dragons and their crews, he is very welcome to try, and we can give him a taste of those guns the militia fellows have been so busily digging in. It would be a pity to waste all their hard work." "I confess I would not mind a chance to give that rascal yet another dose of medicine," Lenton said. "But he will not be so foolish. We must be content with having done our duty and let the Austrians have the glory of polishing him off. His hope of invasion is done." He swallowed the rest of his port and said abruptly, "There is no more putting it off, though, I'm afraid. We cannot need anything more from Choiseul now." In the silence that fell among them, Harcourt's drawn breath was almost a sob, but she made no protest, and her voice remained admirably steady as she merely asked, "Have you decided what you will do with Precursoris?" "We will send him to Newfoundland, if he will go. They need another breeding sire there to fill out their complement, and it is not as though he were vicious," Lenton said. "The fault is with Choiseul, not him." He shook his head. "It is a damned pity, of course, and all our beasts will be creeping about miserable for days, but there is nothing else for it. Best to get it done with quickly, tomorrow morning." Choiseul was given a few moments with Precursoris, the big dragon nearly draped with chains and watched closely by Maximus and Temeraire on either side. Lawrence felt the shudders go through Temeraire's body as they stood their unpleasant guard, forced to observe, while Precursoress swung his head from side to side in denial, and Choiseul made a desperate attempt to persuade him to accept the shelter Lenton had offered. At last the great head drooped in the barest hint of a nod, and Choiseul stepped close to lay his cheek against the smooth nose. Then the guards stepped forward. Precursoress tried to lash at them, but the entangling chains pulled him back, and as they led Choiseul away, the dragon screamed. A dreadful sound. Temeraire hunched himself away from it, his wings flaring, and moaned softly. Lawrence leaned forward and stretched himself fully against his neck, stroking over and over. "Do not look, my dear," he said, the words struggling to come through the thickening of his throat. "It will be over in a moment." Precursoress screamed once more at the end. Then he fell to the ground heavily, as if all vital force had gone from his body. Lenton signalled that they might go, and Lawrence touched Temeraire's side. "Away, away," he said, and Temeraire launched himself far from the scaffold at once, striking out over the clean, empty sea. "Lawrence, may I bring Maximus over here, and Lily?" Berkeley asked in his usual abrupt way, having come upon him without warning. "Your clearing is big enough, I think." Lawrence raised his head and stared at him dully. Temeraire was still huddled in misery, head hidden beneath his wings, inconsolable. And they had flown for hours, just the two of them, and the ocean below, until Lawrence had at last begged him to turn back to land, out of fear that he would become exhausted. He himself felt almost bruised and ill, as if feverish. He had attended at hangings before, a grim reality of naval life, and Choiseul had been far more deserving of the fate than many a man Lawrence had seen at the end of a rope. He could not say why he felt such anguish now. "If you like," he said without enthusiasm, letting his head sink again. He did not look up at the rush of wings and shadows as Maximus came over the clearing, his enormous bulk blotting out the sun until he landed heavily beside Temeraire. Lily followed after him. They huddled at once around each other and Temeraire. After a few moments Temeraire unwound himself enough to entwine more thoroughly with them both, and Lily spread her great wings over them all. Berkeley led Harcourt over to where Lawrence sat, leaning against Temeraire's side, and pushed her unresisting to sit beside him. He lowered his stout frame awkwardly to the ground opposite them, and handed about a dark bottle. Lawrence took it and drank without curiosity, strong, unwatered rum, and he had not eaten anything all day. It went to his head very quickly, and he was glad for the muffling of all sensation. Harcourt began to weep after a little while, and Lawrence was horrified to find his own face wet even as he reached to grip her shoulder. "He was a traitor." "Nothing but a lying traitor," Harcourt said, scrubbing tears away with the back of her hand. "I am not sorry in the least. I am not sorry at all." She spoke with an effort, as though she were trying to convince herself. Berkeley handed her the bottle again. "It is not him. Damned rotter, deserved it," he said. "You are sorry on account of the dragon, and so are they. They don't think much of king and country, you know. Precursoress never knew a damned thing about it, but where Choiseul told him to go." "Tell me," Lawrence said abruptly, "would Bonaparte have really executed the dragon for treason?" "Likely enough. The Continentals do once in a great while. More to scare the riders off the notion than because they blame the beasts," Berkeley said. Lawrence was sorry to have asked, sorry to know that Choiseul had been telling the truth so far at least. "Surely the Corps would have granted him shelter in the colonies if he had asked," he said angrily. "There is still no possible excuse. He desired his place in France restored. He was willing to risk Precursoress to have it back, or we might just as easily have chosen to put his dragon to death." Berkeley shook his head. "Knew we are too hard up for breeders to do as much," he said. "Not to excuse the fellow, I dare say you are right. He thought Bonaparte was going to roll us up, and he did not like to go and live in the colonies." Berkeley shrugged. "Still damned hard on the dragon, and he has not done anything wrong." "That is not true. He has," Temeraire put in unexpectedly, and they looked up at him. Maximus and Lily raised their heads as well to listen. "Choiseul could not have forced him to fly away from France, nor to come here bent on hurting us. It does not seem to me that he is any less guilty at all."
I suppose it is likely he did not understand what was being asked of him, Harcourt said tentatively to this challenge.
Temeraire said, Then he ought to have refused until he did understand. He is not simple like Volley. He might have saved his rider's life then, and his honour too. I would be ashamed to let my rider be executed, and not me too, if I had done as much, he added venomously, his tail lashing the air. And I would not let anyone execute Lawrence anyway. I should like to see them try.
Maximus and Lily both rumbled in agreement.
I will never let Berkeley commit treason, ever, Maximus said. But if he did, I would step on anyone who tried to hang him.
I would just take Catherine and go away, I think, Lily said. But perhaps Precursorus would have liked to do the same. I suppose he could not break all those chains, for he is smaller than either of you, and he cannot spray. Also, there was only one of him, and he was being guarded. I do not know what I would do if I could not have escaped.
She finished softly, and they all began to slump down in fresh misery, huddling together again, until Temeraire stopped and said with sudden decision, I will tell you what we shall do. If ever you need to rescue Catherine, or you, Berkeley, Maximus, I will help you, and you will do as much for me. Then we do not need to worry. I do not suppose anyone could stop all three of us, at least not before we could escape.
All three of them appeared immeasurably cheered by this excellent scheme. Lawrence was now regretting the amount of rum he had consumed, for he could not properly form the protest he felt had to be made, and urgently.
Enough of that, you damned conspirators. You will have us hanged a great deal sooner than we will,
Berkeley said, thankfully on his behalf.
Will you have something to eat now? We're not going to eat until you do, and if you're so busy to protect us, you may as well begin by saving us from starvation. I do not think you are in any danger of starving, Maximus said. The surgeon said only 2 weeks ago that you are too fat.
The devil! Berkeley said indignantly, sitting up, and Maximus snorted in amusement at having provoked him. But shortly the three dragons did allow themselves to be persuaded to take some food, and Maximus and Lily returned to their own clearings to be fed.
I am still sorry for Precursorus, even though he acted badly, Temeraire said presently, having finished his meal. I do not see why they could not let Choiseul go off to the colonies with him.
There must be a price for such things, or else men would do them more often. And in any case, he deserved to be punished for it, Lawrence said. His own head had cleared with some food and strong coffee. Choiseul meant to make Lily suffer as much as Precursorus does. Only imagine if the French had me prisoner, and demanded that you fly for them against your friends and former comrades to save my life.
Yes, I do see,
Temeraire said, but with dissatisfaction in his tone.
Yet it still seems to me they might have punished him differently. Would it not have been better to keep him a prisoner and force Precursorus to fly for us?
I see you have a nice sense of the appropriate, Lawrence said, but I do not know that I can see any lesser punishment for treason. It is too despicable a crime to be punished by mere imprisonment.
And yet Precursorus is not to be punished the same way only because it is not practical, and he is needed for breeding, Temeraire said.
Lawrence considered the matter and could not find an answer for this. I suppose, in all honesty, being aviators ourselves, we cannot like the idea of putting a dragon to death, and so we have found an excuse for letting him live, he said finally. And as our laws are meant for men, perhaps it is not wholly fair to enforce them upon him.
Oh, that I can well agree with, Temeraire said. Some of the laws which I have heard make very little sense, and I do not know that I would obey them if it were not to oblige you. It seems to me that if you wish to apply laws to us, it were only reasonable to consult us on them, and from what you have read to me about Parliament, I do not think any dragons are invited to go there.
Next you will cry out against taxation without representation and throw a basket of tea into the harbour, Lawrence said. You are indeed a very Jacobin at heart, and I think I must give up trying to cure you of it. I can but wash my hands and deny responsibility.
Chapter 12. By the next morning, Precursorus had already gone, sent away to a dragon transport launching from Portsmouth for the small covert in Nova Scotia, whence he would be led to Newfoundland, and at last immured in the breeding grounds which had lately been started there.
Lawrence had avoided any further sight of the stricken dragon, and deliberately had kept Temeraire awake late the night before so that he would sleep past the moment of departure. Lenton had chosen his time as wisely as he could. The general rejoicing over the victory at Trafalgar continued, and served to counter the private unhappiness to some extent. That very day, a display of fireworks was announced by pamphlets to be held over the mouth of the Thames, and Lily, Temeraire, and Maximus, being the youngest of the dragons at the covert and the worst affected, were sent to observe by Lenton's orders. Lawrence was deeply grateful for the word as the brilliant displays lit the sky and the music from the barges drifted to them across the water. Temeraire's eyes were wide with excitement, the bright bursts of colour reflecting in his pupils and his scales, and he cocked his head first one way, then another, in an effort to hear more clearly. He talked of nothing but the music and the explosions and the lights all the way back to the covert. "Is that a concert, then, the sort they have in Dover?" he asked. "Lawrence, cannot we go again, and perhaps a little closer next time? I could sit very quietly, and I would not disturb anyone."
"I'm afraid fireworks such as those are a special occasion, my dear. Concerts are only music," Lawrence said, avoiding an answer.
He could well imagine the reaction of the city's inhabitants to a dragon's coming to take in a concert. "Oh," Temeraire said, but he was not greatly dampened. "I would still like that extremely. I could not hear very well tonight."
"I do not know that there is any suitable accommodation which could be made in the city," Lawrence said slowly and reluctantly. But happily a sudden inspiration came to him, and he added, "But perhaps I can hire some musicians to come to the covert and play for you instead. That would be a great deal more comfortable in any case." "Yes, indeed, that would be splendid," Temeraire said eagerly. He communicated this idea to Maximus and Lily as soon as they had all once again landed, and the two of them professed equal interest. "Damn you, Lawrence, you had much better learn to say no. You will be forever getting us into these absurd starts," Berkeley said. "Just see if any musicians will come here, for love or money." "For love, perhaps not. But for a week's wages and a hearty meal, I'm quite certain most musicians could be persuaded to play in the heart of Bedlam," Lawrence said. "It sounds a fine idea to me," Harcourt said. "I would quite like it myself. I have not been to a concert, except once when I was 16. I had to put on skirts for it, and after only half an hour a dreadful fellow sat next to me and whispered impolite remarks until I poured a pot of coffee into his lap. It quite spoiled my pleasure, even though he went away straight after." "Christ above, Harcourt! If I ever have reason to offend you, I'll make damned sure you have nothing hot at hand," Berkeley said, while Lawrence struggled between nearly equal portions of dismay at her having been subjected to such insult, and at her means of repulsion. "Well, I would have struck him, but I would have had to get up. You have no notion how difficult it is to arrange skirts when sitting down. It took me 5 minutes together the first time," she said reasonably, "so I did not want to have it all to do again. Then the waiter came by, and I thought that would be easier, and anyway, more like something a girl ought to do." Still a little pale with the notion, Lawrence bade them good night and took Temeraire off to his rest. He slept once again in the small tent by his side, even though he thought Temeraire was well over his distress, and was rewarded in the morning by being woken early, Temeraire peering into the tent with one great eye, and inquiring if perhaps Lawrence would like to go to Dover and arrange for the concert today. "I would like to sleep until a civilized hour, but as that is evidently not to be, perhaps I will ask leave of Lenton to go," Lawrence said, yawning as he crawled from the tent. "May I have my breakfast first?"
"Oh, certainly," Temeraire said, with an air of generosity. Muttering a little, Lawrence pulled his coat back on and began to walk back to the headquarters. Halfway to the building he nearly collided with Morgan, running to find him. "Sir, Admiral Lenton wants you," the boy said, panting with excitement when Lawrence had steadied him. "And he says Temeraire is to go into combat rig."
"Very good," Lawrence said, concealing his surprise. "Go tell Lieutenant Granby and Mr. Hollin at once, and then do as Lieutenant Granby tells you. Mind you speak of this to no one else."
"Yes, sir," the boy said, and dashed off again to the barracks. Lawrence quickened his pace.
"Come in, Lawrence,"
Lenton said in reply to his knock. It seemed that every other captain in the covert was already crowded into the office as well. To Lawrence's surprise, Rankin was at the front of the room, sitting by Lenton's desk.
By wordless agreement, they had managed to avoid speaking to one another since Rankin's transfer from Loch Lagan, and Lawrence had known nothing of his and Levitas's activities. These had evidently been more dangerous than Lawrence might have imagined. A bandage round Rankin's thigh was visibly stained with blood, and his clothes also. His thin face was pale and set with pain. Lenton waited only until the door had closed behind the last few stragglers to begin. He said grimly, "I dare say you already realize, gentlemen, we have been celebrating too soon. Captain Rankin has just returned from a flight over the coast. He was able to slip past their borders and caught a look at what that damned Corsican has been working on. You may see for yourselves." He pushed across his desk a sheet of paper smudged with dirt and bloodstains that did not obscure an elegantly drafted diagram in Rankin's precise hand. Lawrence frowned, trying to puzzle the thing out. It looked rather like a ship of the line, but with no railings at all around her upper deck and no masts shipped, with strange thick beams protruding from both sides fore and aft, and no gun ports. "What is it for?" Chenery said, turning it around. "I thought he already had boats." "Perhaps it will become clearer if I explain that he had dragons carrying them about over the ground," Rankin said. Lawrence understood at once. The beams were intended to give the dragons a place to hold. Napoleon meant to fly his troops over the Navy's guns entirely, while so many of Britain's aerial forces were occupied at the Mediterranean. Lenton said, "We are not certain how many men he will have in each." "Sir, I beg your pardon. May I ask, how long are these vessels?" Lawrence asked, interrupting. "And is this to scale?" "To my eye, yes," Rankin said. "The one which I saw in mid-air had 2 reapers to a side and room to spare, perhaps 200 feet from front to back." "There will be 3 deckers inside, then," Lawrence said grimly. "If they sling hammocks, he can fit as many as 2,000 men apiece for a short journey, if he means to carry no provisions." A murmur of alarm went around the room. Lenton said, "Less than 2 hours to cross each way, even if they launch from Cherbourg, and he has 60 dragons or more." "He could land 50,000 men by mid-morning, good God," said one of the captains Lawrence did not know, a man who had arrived only recently. The same calculation was running in all their heads. It was impossible not to look about the room and tally their own side. Less than 20 men, a good quarter of whom were the scout and courier captains whose beasts could do very little in combat. "But surely the things must be hopeless to manage in the air, and can the dragons carry such a weight?" Sutton asked, studying the design further. "Likely he has built them from light wood. He only needs them to last a day, after all, and they need not be watertight," Lawrence said. "He needs only an easterly wind to carry him over. With that narrow framing, they will offer very little resistance. But they will be vulnerable in the air, and surely Excidium and Mortiferous are already on their way back." 4 days away at best, and Bonaparte must know that as well as we do," Lenton said. "He has spent nearly his entire fleet, and the Spanish as well, to buy himself freedom from their presence. He is not going to waste the chance." The obvious truth of this was felt at once. A grim and expectant silence fell upon the room. Lenton looked down at his desk, then stood up, uncharacteristically slow. Lawrence, for the first time, noticed that his hair was grey and thin. "Gentlemen," Lenton said formally, "the wind is in the north today, so we may have a little grace if he chooses to wait for a better wind. All of our scouts will be flying in shifts just off Cherbourg. We will have an hour's warning at least. I do not need to tell you we will be hopelessly outnumbered. We can only do our best, and delay if we cannot prevent." No one spoke, and after a moment he said, "We will need every heavy and middleweight beast on independent duty. Your task will be to destroy these transports. Chenery, Warren, the 2 of you will take mid-wing positions in Lily's formation, and 2 of our scouts will take the wingtip positions. Captain Harcourt, undoubtedly Bonaparte will reserve some dragons for defence. Your task is to keep those defenders occupied as best you can." "Yes, sir," she said. The others nodded. Lenton took a deep breath and rubbed his face. "There is nothing else to be said, gentlemen. Go to your preparations." There was no sense in keeping it from the men. The French had nearly caught Rankin on his way back, and already knew that their secret at last was out. Lawrence quietly told his lieutenants, then sent them about their work. He could see the passage of the news through the ranks, men leaning in to hear from one another, their faces hardening as they grasped the situation, and the ordinary idle conversation of a morning vanishing quite away. He was proud to see even the youngest officers take it with great courage and go straight back to their work. This was the first time Temeraire would ever use the complete accoutrement of heavy combat outside of practice. For patrol, a much lighter set of gear was used, and their previous engagement had been under travelling harness. Temeraire stood very straight and still, only his head turned about so he could watch with great excitement as the men rigged him out with the heaviest leather harness triple riveted and began hooking in the enormous panels of chain mesh that would serve as armour. Lawrence began his own inspection of the equipment and belatedly realised that Hollin was nowhere to be seen. He looked 3 times through the whole clearing before he quite believed the man's absence, and then called the armourer Pratt away from his work on the great protective plates which would shield Temeraire's breast and shoulders during the fighting.
"Where is Mr. Hollin?" he asked.
"Why, I don't believe I've seen him this morning, sir," Pratt said, scratching his head. "He was in last night, though."
"Very good," Lawrence said, and dismissed him. "Roland, Dyer, Morgan," he called, and when the 3 runners came, he said, "Go and see if you can find Mr. Hollin, and then tell him I expect him here at once, if you please."
"Yes, sir," they said almost in unison, and dashed off in different directions after a hurried consultation. He returned to watching the men work, a deep frown on his face. He was astonished and dismayed to find the man failing in his duty at all, and under these circumstances most particularly. He wondered if Hollin could have fallen ill and gone to the surgeons. It seemed the only excuse, but the man would surely have told one of his crewmates. More than an hour went by, and Temeraire was in full rig with the crew practising boarding manoeuvres under Lieutenant Granby's severe eye, before young Roland came hurrying back to the clearing. "Sir," she said, panting and unhappy. "Sir, Mr. Hollin is with Levitas. Please do not be angry," she said, all in one rushing breath. "Ah," Lawrence said, a little embarrassed. He could hardly admit to Roland that he had been turning a blind eye to Hollin's visits, so she naturally was reluctant to be a tale-bearer on a fellow aviator.
"You will have to answer for it, but that can wait. Go and tell him he is needed at once."
"Sir, I told him so, but he said he cannot leave Levitas, and he told me to go away at once and to tell you that he begs you to come if only you can," she said very quickly, and eyeing him nervously to see how he would take this insubordination.
How are you?
Lawrence stared. He could not account for the extraordinary response, but after a moment his estimate of Hollin's character decided him.
"Mr. Granby," he called, "I must go for a moment. I leave things in your hands. Roland, stay here and come fetch me at once if anything occurs," he told her.
He walked quickly, torn between temper and concern, and reluctance to once again expose himself to a complaint from Rankin, particularly under the circumstances. No one could deny the man had done his duty bravely just now, and to offer him insult directly after would be an extraordinary piece of rudeness. And at the same time Lawrence could not help but grow angry at the man as he followed Roland's directions. Levitas's clearing was one of the small ones nearest the headquarters, undoubtedly chosen for Rankin's convenience rather than his dragon's. The grounds were poorly tended, and when Levitas came into view, Lawrence saw he was lying in a circle of bare, sandy dirt, with his head in Hollin's lap.
"Well, Mr. Hollin, what's all this?"
Lawrence said, irritation making his tone sharp. Then he came around and saw the great expanse of bandages that covered Levitas's flank and belly, hidden from the other side and already soaked through with the near-black blood. "My God!" he said involuntarily. Levitas's eyes opened a little at the sound, and turned up to look at him hopefully. They were glazed and bright with pain, but after a moment recognition came into them, and the little dragon sighed and closed them again without a word.
"Sir," Hollin said, "I'm sorry, I know I've my duty, but I couldn't leave him. The surgeon's gone, says there's nothing more to be done for him and it won't be long. There is no one here at all, not even to send for some water." He stopped and said again, "I couldn't leave him." Lawrence knelt beside him and put his hand on Levitas's head, very lightly for fear of causing him more pain. "No," he said, "of course not." He was glad now to find himself so close to the headquarters. There were some crewmen idling by the door talking of the news, so he could send them to Hollin's assistance, and Rankin was in the officers' club, easily found. He was drinking wine, his colour already greatly improved, and having shifted his blood-stained clothing for fresh. Lenton and a couple of the scout captains were sitting with him and discussing positions to hold along the coastline. Coming up to him,
Lawrence told him very quietly. "If you can walk, get on your feet. Otherwise I will carry you." Rankin put down his glass and stared at him coldly. "I beg your pardon," he said. "I gather this is some more of your officious—" Lawrence paid no attention, but seized the back of his chair and heaved. Rankin fell forward, scrabbling to catch himself on the floor. Lawrence took him by the scruff of his coat and dragged him up to his feet, ignoring his gasp of pain. "Lawrence, what in God's name?" Lenton said in astonishment, rising to his feet. "Levitas is dying. Captain Rankin wishes to make his farewells," Lawrence said, looking Lenton squarely in the eye and holding Rankin up by the collar and the arm. "He begs to be excused." The other captains stared, half out of their chairs. Lenton looked at Rankin, then very deliberately sat back down again. "Very good," he said, and reached for the bottle. The other captains slowly sank back down as well. Rankin stumbled along in his grip, not even trying to free himself, shrinking a little from Lawrence as they went. Outside the clearing, Lawrence stopped and faced him. "You will be generous to him, do you understand me?" he said. "You will give him every word of praise he has earned from you and never received. You will tell him he has been brave and loyal and a better partner than you have deserved." Rankin said nothing, only stared as if Lawrence were a dangerous lunatic. Lawrence shook him again. "By God, you will do all this and more, and hope that it is enough to satisfy me," he said savagely, and dragged him on. Hollin was still sitting with Levitas's head in his lap, a bucket now beside him. He was squeezing water from a clean cloth into the dragon's open mouth. He looked at Rankin without bothering to hide his contempt, but then he bent over and said, "Levitas, come along now. Look who's come." Levitas's eyes opened, but they were milky and blind. "My captain?" he said uncertainly. Lawrence thrust Rankin forward and down onto his knees, none too gently. Rankin gasped and clutched at his thigh, but he said, "Yes, I am here." He looked up at Lawrence and swallowed, then added awkwardly, "You have been very brave." There was nothing natural or sincere in the tone. It was as ungraceful as could be imagined. But Levitas only said, very softly, "You came." He licked at a few drops of water at the corner of his mouth. The blood was still welling sluggishly from beneath the dressing, thick enough to slightly part the bandages one from the other, glistening and black. Rankin shifted uneasily. His breeches and stockings were being soaked through, but he looked up at Lawrence and did not try to move away. Levitas gave a low sigh, and then the shallow movement of his sides ceased. Hollin closed his eyes with one rough hand. Lawrence's hand was still heavy on the back of Rankin's neck. Now he lifted it away, rage gone, and only tight-lipped disgust left. "Go," he said. "We, who valued him, will make the arrangements, not you." He did not even look at the man as Rankin left the clearing. "I cannot stay," he said quietly to Hollin. "Can you manage?" "Yes," Hollin said, stroking the little head. "There can't be anything with the battle coming at all, but I'll see he's taken and buried proper. Thank you, sir. It meant a great deal to him." "More than it ought," Lawrence said. He stood looking down at Levitas a short while longer. Then he went back to the headquarters and found Admiral Lenton. "Well," Lenton said, scowling as Lawrence was shown into his office. "Sir, I apologize for my behavior," Lawrence said. "I'm happy to bear any consequences you should think appropriate." No, what are you talking about? I mean Levitas," Lenton said impatiently. Lawrence paused, then said, "Dead, with a great deal of pain. But he went easily at the end." Lenton shook his head. "Damned pity," he said, pouring a glass of brandy for Lawrence and himself. He finished his own glass in 2 great swallows and sighed heavily. "And a wretched time for Rankin to become unharnessed," he said. "We have a Winchester hatching unexpectedly at Chatham, any day now by the hardening of the shell. I have been scrambling to find a fellow in range worthy of the position and willing to be put to a Winchester. Now here he is on the loose and having made himself a hero bringing us this news. If I don't send him and the beast ends up unharnessed, we will have a yowl from his entire damned family, and a question taken up in Parliament like as not."
I would rather see a dragon dead than in his hands, Lawrence said, setting down his glass hard. So, if you want a man who will be a credit to the service, send Mr. Hollin. I would vouch with my life for him. What? Your ground crew master? Lenton frowned at him, but thoughtfully. That is a thought. If you think him suited for the task, he could not feel he was hurting his career by such a step. Not a gentleman, I suppose. No, sir, unless by gentleman you mean a man of honour rather than breeding, Lawrence said. Lenton snorted at this. Well, we're not so stiff-necked a lot we must pay that a great deal of mind, he said. I dare say it will answer nicely, if we are not all dead or captured by the time the egg cracks, at any rate. Hollin stared when Lawrence relieved him of his duties and said a little helplessly, My own dragon? He had to turn away and hide his face. Lawrence pretended not to see. Sir, I don't know how to thank you, he said, whispering to keep his voice from breaking. I have promised you will be a credit to the service. See to it you do not make me a liar, and I will be content, Lawrence said and shook his hand. You must go at once. The hatching is expected at almost any day, and there is a carriage waiting to take you to Chatham. Looking dazed, Hollin accepted Lawrence's hand and the bag with his few possessions which his fellows on the ground crew had hastily packed for him, then allowed himself to be led off towards the waiting carriage by young Dyer. The crew were beaming upon him as they went. He was obliged to shake a great many hands until Lawrence, fearing he would never get under way, said, Gentlemen, the wind is still in the north. Let us get some of this armour off Temeraire for the night, and put them to work. Temeraire watched him go a little sadly. I am very glad that the new dragon will have him instead of Rankin, but I wish they had given him to Levitas sooner, and perhaps Hollin would have kept him from dying, he said to Lawrence as the crew worked on him. We cannot know what would have happened, Lawrence said, but I am not certain Levitas could ever have been happy with such an exchange. Even at the end he only wanted Rankin's affection, as strange as that seems to us. Lawrence slept with Temeraire again that evening, close and sheltered in his arms, and wrapped in several woolen blankets against the early frost. He woke just before first light to see the barren treetops bending away from the sunrise, an easterly wind blowing from France. Temeraire, he called quietly, and the great head rose up above him to sniff the air. The wind has changed, Temeraire said, and bent down to nuzzle him. Lawrence allowed himself the indulgence of 5 minutes, lying warm and embraced, with his hands resting on the narrow, tender scales of Temeraire's nose. I hope I have never given you cause for unhappiness, my dear, he said softly. Never, Lawrence, Temeraire said, very low. The ground crew came hurrying from the barracks the moment he touched the bell. The chain mesh had been left in the clearing under a cloth, and Temeraire had slept in the heavy harness for this once. He was quickly fitted out, while at the other side of the clearing Granby reviewed every man's harness and carabiners. Lawrence submitted to his inspection as well, then took a moment to clean and reload his pistols fresh and belt on his sword. The sky was cold and white, a few darker grey clouds scudding like shadows. No orders had come yet. At Lawrence's request, Temeraire lifted him up to his shoulder and reared onto his hind legs. He could see the dark line of the ocean past the trees, and the ships bobbing in the harbour. The wind came strongly into his face, cold and salt. "Thank you, Temeraire," he said, and Temeraire set him down again. "Mr. Granby, we will get the crew aboard," Lawrence said. The ground crew put up a great noise, more a roar than a cheer, as Temeraire rose into the air. Lawrence could hear it echoed throughout the covert as the other great beasts beat up into the sky. Maximus was a great blazing presence in his red-gold brilliance, dwarfing the others. Victoriatus and Lily also stood out against the crowd of smaller yellow reapers. Lenton's flag was streaming from his dragon Obversaria, the golden angle wing. She was only a little larger than the reapers, but she cut through the crowd of dragons and took the lead with effortless grace, her wings rotating almost as did Temeraire's. As the larger dragons had been set on independent duty, Temeraire did not need to keep to the formation's speed. He quickly negotiated a position near the leading edge of the force. The wind was in their faces, cold and damp, and the low whistling shriek of their passage carried away all noise,
leaving only the leathery snap of Temeraire's wings, each beat like a sail going taut, and the creaking of the harness. Nothing else broke the unnatural, heavy silence of the crew. They were already drawn in sight. At this distance the French dragons seemed a cloud of gulls or sparrows, so many were they, and wheeling so in unison. The French were keeping at a considerable height, some 900 feet above the surface of the water, well out of range of even the longest pepper guns. Below them, a lovely and futile spread of white sail. The Channel Fleet, many of the ships wreathed in smoke where they had tried a hopeless shot. More of the ships had taken up positions nearer the land, despite the terrible danger of placing themselves so close to a leeward shore. If the French could be forced to land very near the edge of the cliffs, they might yet come into range of the long guns, if briefly. Excidium and Mortiferous were racing back from Trafalgar at frantic speed with their formations, but they could not hope to arrive before the end of the week. There was not a man among them but had known to a nicety the numbers which the French could muster against them. Rationally, there had never been any cause for hope. Even so, it was a different thing to see those numbers made flesh and wing. Fully 12 of the light wooden transports which Rankin had spied out, each carried by 4 dragons, and defended by as many more besides. Lawrence had never heard of such a force in modern warfare. It was the stuff of the Crusades, when dragons had been smaller and the country more wild, the more easily to feed them. This occurring to him, Lawrence turned to Granby and said calmly, loud enough to carry back to the men, "The logistics of feeding so many dragons together must be impractical for any extended period. He will not be able to try this again soon." Granby only stared at him a moment, then with a start he said hurriedly, "Just so, right you are. Should we give the men a little exercise? I think we have at least half an hour's grace before we meet them." "Very good," Lawrence said, pushing himself up to his feet. The force of the wind was great, but braced against his straps he was able to turn around. The men did not quite like to meet his eyes, but there was an effect. Backs straightened, whispers stopped. None of them cared to show fear or reluctance to his face. "Mr. Johns, exchange of positions, if you please," Granby called through his speaking trumpet. Shortly the top men and bellmen had run through their exchange under the direction of their lieutenants, and the men were warmed up against the biting wind. Their faces looked a little less pinched. They could not engage in true gunnery practice with the other crews so close, but with a commendable show of energy, Lieutenant Riggs had his riflemen fire blanks to loosen their fingers. Dunn had long, thin hands that present bled white with cold. As he struggled to reload, his powder horn slipped out of his fingers and nearly went over the side. Collins only saved it by leaning nearly straight out from Temeraire's back, just barely catching the cord. Temeraire glanced back once as the shots went off, but straightened himself again without any reminder. He was flying easily, at a pace which he could have sustained for the better part of a day. His breathing was not laboured or even much quickened. His only difficulty was an excess of high spirits. As the French dragons came more closely into view, he succumbed to excitement and put on a burst of speed, but at the touch of Lawrence's hand he drew back again into the line. The French defenders had formed into a loosely woven line of battle, the larger dragons above, with the smaller ones beneath in a darting, unpredictable mass, forming a wall shielding the transport vessels and their carriers. Lawrence felt if only they could break through the line there might be some hope. The carriers, most of them of the middleweight Pêcher breed, were labouring greatly. The unaccustomed weight was telling on them, and he was sure they would be vulnerable to an attack. But they had 23 dragons to the French 40 and more defenders, and almost a quarter of the British force was made up of Greylings and Winchesters, no proper match for the combat weight dragons. Getting through the line would be nearly impossible, and once through, any attacker would immediately be isolated and vulnerable in turn. On Obversaria, Lenton sent up the flags for attack. Engage the enemy more closely. Lawrence felt his own heart begin beating faster, with the tremble of excitement that would fade only after the first moments of battle. He raised the speaking trumpet and called forward, "Choose your target, Temeraire! If ever you can get us alongside a transport, you cannot do wrong!" In the confusion of the enormous crowd of dragons, he trusted Temeraire's instincts better than his own. If there was a gap in the French line, Lawrence was sure that Temeraire would see it. By way of answer, Temeraire struck out immediately for one of the outlying transports, as if he meant to go straight at it. Abruptly he folded his wings and dived, and the 3 French dragons who had closed ranks in front of him dashed in pursuit. Swivelling his wings, Temeraire halted himself in mid-air while the 3 went flashing past. With a few mighty wing strokes, he was now flying directly up towards the unprotected belly of the first carrier on the larboard side, and now Lawrence could see that this dragon, a smaller female pêcheresse, was visibly tired, her wings labouring even though her pace was still regular.
"Ready, bombs!"
Lawrence shouted. As Temeraire came hurtling past the pêcheresse and slashed at the French dragon's side, the crew hurled the bombs onto the deck of the transport. The crack of gunfire came from the pêcheur's back, and Lawrence heard a cry behind him. Collins threw up his arms and went limp in his harness, his rifle tumbling away into the water below. A moment later the body followed. He was dead, and one of the others had cut him loose. There were no guns on the transport itself, but the deck was built slanting like a roof. 3 of the bombs rolled off before they could burst, drifting smoke as they fell uselessly. However, 2 exploded in time. The whole transport sagged in mid-air as the shock briefly threw the pêcheur off her pace, gaping holes torn in the wooden planking. Lawrence caught a single glimpse of a pale, staring face inside, smudged with dirt and inhuman with terror. Then Temeraire was angling away.
Be careful.
Blood was dripping from somewhere below, a thin black stream. Lawrence leaned to check, but saw no injury. Temeraire was flying well.
"Granby!"
he shouted, pointing.
"From his claws! The other beast!"
Granby shouted back after a moment, and Lawrence nodded. But there was no opportunity for a second pass. 2 more French dragons were coming at them directly. Temeraire beat up quickly into the sky, the enemy beasts following. They had seen his trick of manoeuvring and were coming at a more cautious pace so as not to overrun him.
"Double back! Straight down and at them!" Lawrence called to Temeraire.
"Guns ready!" Riggs shouted behind him, as Temeraire drew a deep, swelling breath and neatly turned back on himself in mid-air. No longer at war with gravity, he plummeted towards the French dragons, roaring furiously. The tremendous volume rattled Lawrence's bones even in the face of the wind. The dragon in the lead recoiled, shrieking, and entangled the head of the second in its wings. Temeraire flew straight down between them, through the bitter smoke of the enemy gunfire, the British rifles speaking in answer. Several of the enemy dead were already cut loose and falling. Temeraire lashed out and carved a gash along the second dragon's flank as they went past. The spurting blood splashed Lawrence's trousers, fever hot against his skin. They were away, and the 2 attackers were still struggling to right themselves. The first was flying very badly and making shrill noises of pain. Even as Lawrence glanced behind them, he saw the dragon being turned back for France. With their advantage in numbers, Bonaparte's aviators had no need to push their dragons past injury.
"Bravely done!"
Lawrence called, unable to keep jubilation, pride, out of his voice, as absurd as it was to indulge in such sentiments at the height of so desperate a battle. Behind him, the crew cheered wildly as the second of the French dragons pulled away to find another opponent, not daring to attempt Temeraire alone. At once, Temeraire was winging back towards their original target, head raised proudly. He was still unmarked. Their formation partner, Massoria, was at the transport. 30 years of experience made her and Sutton wily, and they too had won past the line of battle to continue the attack on the already weakened pêcheur, whom Temeraire had injured. A pair of the smaller Pou de Ciel were defending the pêcheur. Together they were more than Massoria's weight, but she was making use of every trick she had, skillfully baiting them forward, trying to make an opening for a dash at the pêcheur. More smoke was pouring from the transport's deck. Sutton's crew had evidently managed to land a few more bombs upon it. "Flank to larboard," Sutton signalled from Massoria's back as they approached. Massoria made a dash at the 2 defenders to keep their attention on her, while Temeraire swept forward and lashed at the pêcheur's side, his claws tearing through the chain mesh with a hideous noise. Dark blood spurted. Bellowing, instinctively trying to lash out at Temeraire in defence, the pêcheur let go the beam with one foreleg. It was secured to the dragon's body by many heavy chains, but even so the transport listed visibly down, and Lawrence could hear the men inside yelling. Temeraire made an ungraceful but effective fluttering hop, and avoided the strike, still closely engaged. He tore away more of the chain mesh, and clawed the pêcheur again.
"Prepare volley!" Riggs bellowed, and the riflemen strafed the Pêcheur's back cruelly. Lawrence saw one of the French officers taking aim at Temeraire's head. He fired his own pistols, and with the second shot the man went down clutching his leg. "Sir, permission to board!" Granby called forward. The Pêcheur's top men and riflemen had suffered heavy losses. Its back was largely cleared, and the opportunity was ideal. Granby was standing at the ready with a dozen of the men, all of them with swords drawn and hands ready to unlock their carabiners. Lawrence had been dreading this possibility of all things. It was only with deep reluctance that he gave Temeraire the word and laid them alongside the French dragon. "Boarders away!" he shouted, waving Granby his permission with a low, sinking feeling in his belly. Nothing could have been more unpleasant than to watch his men make that terrifying, unharnessed leap into the waiting enemy's hands while he himself had to remain at his station. A terrible, ululating cry in the near distance. Lily had just struck a French dragon full in the face, and it was scrabbling and clawing at its own face, jerking in one direction and then the next, frenzied with the pain. Temeraire's shoulders hunched with sympathy just as the Pêcheur's did. Lawrence flinched himself from the intolerable sound. Then the screaming stopped, abruptly. A sickening relief. The captain had crept out along the neck and put a bullet into his own dragon's head, rather than see the creature die slowly as the acid ate through the skull and into the brain. Many of his crew had leapt to other dragons for safety, some even to Lily's back, but he had sacrificed the opportunity. Lawrence saw him falling alongside the tumbling dragon, and they plunged into the ocean together. He wrenched himself from the horrible fascination of the sight. The bloody struggle aboard the Pêcheur's back was going well for them, and he could already see a couple of the midwing men working on the chains that secured the transport to the dragon. But the Pêcheur's distress had not gone unnoticed. Another French dragon was coming towards them at speed, and some exceptionally daring men were climbing out of the holes in the damaged transport, trying to make their way up the chains to the Pêcheur's back to provide assistance. Even as Lawrence caught sight of them, a couple of them slipped on the sloping deck and fell, but there were more than a dozen making the attempt, and if they were to reach the Pêcheur, they would certainly turn the tide of battle against Granby and the boarders. Massoria cried out then, a long, shrill wail. "Fall back!" Lawrence heard Sutton shouting. She was streaming dark blood from a deep cut across her breastbone, another wound on her flank already being packed with white bandage. She dropped and wheeled away, leaving the two Poux de Ciel who had been attacking her at liberty. Though they were much smaller than Temeraire, he could not engage the Pêcheur while under attack from two directions. Lawrence had either to call back the boarding party or abandon them and hope they could take the Pêcheur, securing its surrender by seizing its captain alive. "Granby!" Lawrence shouted. The lieutenant looked around, wiping blood from a cut on his face, and nodded as soon as he saw their position, waving them off. Lawrence touched Temeraire's side and called to him. With a last parting slash across the Pêcheur's flank that laid white bone bare, Temeraire spun away, gaining some distance, and hovered to permit them to survey. The two smaller French dragons did not pursue, but remained hovering close to the Pêcheur. They did not dare try to get close enough to send men over, for Temeraire could easily overwhelm them if they put themselves in so exposed a position. Yet Temeraire himself was also in some danger. The riflemen and half the bellmen had gone for the boarding party. Well worth the risk, for if they took the Pêcheur, the transport could not very well continue on. If it did not fall entirely, at least the three remaining dragons would likely be forced to turn back for France. But that meant Temeraire was now undermanned, and they were vulnerable to boarding themselves. They could not risk another close engagement. The boarding party was making steady progress now against the last men resisting aboard the Pêcheur's back. They would certainly outdistance the men from the transport. One of the Poux de Ciel dashed in and tried to lie alongside the Pêcheur. "At them!" Lawrence called, and Temeraire dived instantly, his raking claws and teeth sending the smaller beast into a hurried retreat. Lawrence had to send Temeraire winging away again, but it had been enough. The French had lost their chance, and the Pêcheur was crying out in alarm, twisting her head around. Granby was standing at the French dragon's neck with a pistol aimed at a man's head. They had taken the captain. At Granby's order, the chains were flung off the Pêcheur, and they turned the captured French dragon's head towards Dover. She flew unwillingly and slowly, head turning back every few moments in anxiety for her captain. But she went,
and the transport was left hanging wildly askew, the 3 remaining dragons struggling desperately under its weight. Lawrence had little opportunity to enjoy the triumph. 2 fresh dragons came diving at them, a petit chevalier considerably larger than Temeraire despite the name, and a middleweight pêcheur cornet, who dashed to seize the sagging support beam. The men still clinging to the roof threw the dangling chains to the fresh dragon's crew, and in moments the transport was righted and underway again. The Pou de Ciel were coming at them again from opposite sides, and the Petit Chevalier was angling round from behind. Their position was exposed and growing rapidly hopeless.
"Withdraw, Temeraire!"
Lawrence called, bitter though the order was to give. Temeraire turned away at once, but the pursuing dragons drew nearer. He had been fighting hard now for nearly half an hour, and he was tiring. The 2 Pou de Ciel were working in concert, trying to herd Temeraire towards the big dragon, darting across his path of flight to slow him. The Petit Chevalier suddenly put on a burst of speed, and as he drew alongside them, a handful of men leapt over.
"Where? Boarders!"
Lieutenant Johns shouted in his hoarse baritone, and Temeraire looked round in alarm. Fear gave him fresh energy to draw away from the pursuit. The Chevalier fell behind, and after Temeraire lashed out and caught one of the Pou de Ciel, they too abandoned the chase. However, there were 8 men already crossed over and latched on. Lawrence grimly reloaded his pistols, thrusting them into his belt, then lengthened his carabiner straps and stood. The 5 top men under Lieutenant Johns were trying to hold the boarders at the middle of Temeraire's back. Lawrence made his way back as quickly as he dared. His first shot went wide. His second took a Frenchman directly in the chest. The man fell, coughing blood, and dangled limply from the harness. Then it was hot, frantic sword work, with the sky whipping past too quickly to see anything but the men before him. A French lieutenant was standing in front of him. The man saw his gold bars and aimed a pistol at him. Lawrence barely heard the speech the man tried to make him and paid no attention, but knocked the gun away with his sword arm and clubbed the Frenchman on the temple with his pistol butt. The lieutenant fell. The man behind him lunged, but the wind of their passage was against him, and the sword thrust scarcely penetrated the leather coat Lawrence wore. Lawrence cut the man's harness straps and kicked him off with a boot to the middle, then looked around for more boarders, but by good fortune the others were all dead or disarmed, and for their part only Challoner and Wright had fallen, except for Lieutenant Johns, who was hanging from his carabiners, blood welling up furiously from a pistol wound in his chest. Before they could try to tend him, he gave a final rattling gasp, and also was still. Lawrence bent down and closed John's dead, staring eyes, and hung his own sword back on his belt.
"Mr. Martin, take command of the top, acting lieutenant. Get these bodies cleared away."
"Yes, sir," Martin said, panting. There was a bloody gash across his cheek and red splashes of blood in his yellow hair.
Yes.
"Is your arm all right, Captain?" Lawrence looked. Blood was seeping a little through the rent in the coat, but he could move the arm easily, and he felt no weakness.
"Only a scratch. I will tie it up directly."
He clambered over a body and back to his station at the neck and latched himself in tight, then pulled loose his neckcloth to wrap around the wound.
"Boarders repelled!"
he called, and the nervous tension left Temeraire's shoulders. Temeraire had drawn away from the battlefield, as proper when boarded. Now he turned back around, and when Lawrence looked up he could see the whole extent of the field of battle, where it was not obscured by smoke and dragon wings. All but 3 of the transports were under no sort of attack at all. The British dragons were being heavily engaged by the French defenders. Lily was flying virtually alone. Only Nitidus remained with her, the others of their formation nowhere in Lawrence's sight. He looked for Maximus and saw him engaged closely with their old enemy, the Grand Chevalier. The intervening 2 months of growth had brought Maximus closer to his size, and the 2 of them were tearing at each other in a terrible savagery. At this distance, the sound of the battle was muffled. Instead, he could hear a more fatal one entirely, the crash of the waves breaking upon the foot of the white cliffs. They had been driven nearly to shore, and he could see the red and white coats of the soldiers formed up on the ground. It was not yet midday. Abruptly, a phalanx of 6 heavyweight dragons broke off from the French line and dived towards the ground, all of them roaring at the top of their lungs while their crews threw bombs down. The thin ranks of redcoats wavered as in a breeze, and the mass of militia in the centre almost broke. men falling to their knees and covering their heads, though scarcely any real damage was done. A dozen guns were fired off, wildly. Shots wasted, Lawrence thought in despair, and the leading transport could make its descent almost unmolested. The 4 carriers drew closer together, flying in a tight knot directly above the transport, and let the keel of the vessel carve a resting place in the ground with its own momentum. The British soldiers in the front ranks threw up their arms as an immense cloud of dirt burst into their faces, and then almost at once half of them fell dead. The whole front of the transport had unhinged like a barn door, and a volley of rifle fire erupted from inside to mow down the front lines. A shout of "Vive l'Empereur!" went up as the French soldiers poured out through the smoke. More than 1,000 men, dragging a pair of 18-pounders with them. The men formed into lines to protect the guns as the artillerymen hurried to bring their charges to bear. The redcoats fired off an answering volley, and a few moments later the militia managed a ragged one of their own. But the Frenchmen were hardened veterans. Though dozens fell dead, the ranks shut tight to fill in their places, and the men held their ground. The 4 dragons who had carried the transport were flinging off their chains. Free of their burden, they rose again to join the fight, leaving the British aerial forces even more outnumbered than before. In a moment another transport would land under this increased protection, and its own carriers worsened the situation further. Maximus roared furiously, clawed free of the Grand Chevalier, and made a sudden desperate stoop towards the next transport as it began to descend. No art or maneuver, he only flung himself down. 2 smaller dragons tried to bar his way, but he had committed his full weight to the dive. Though he took raking blows from their claws and teeth, he bowled them apart by sheer force. One was only knocked aside, the other, a red and blue barred Honneur d'Or, tumbled against the cliffs with one wing splayed helplessly. It scrabbled at the ragged stone face, sending powdery chalk flying as it tried to get purchase and climb up onto the cliff top. A light frigate of some 24 guns with a shallow draft had been daring to stay near the coast. Now she leapt at the chance. Before the dragon could get up over the cliff's edge, her full double-shotted broadside roared out like thunder. The French dragon screamed once over the noise and fell, broken. The unforgiving surf pounded its corpse and the remnants of its crew upon the rocks. Above, Maximus had landed on the second transport and was clawing at the chains. His weight was too much for the carriers to support, but they were struggling valiantly, and with a great heave in unison they managed to get the transport over the edge of the cliff as he finally broke the supports. The wooden shell fell 20 feet through the air and cracked open like an egg, spilling men and guns everywhere, but the distance was not great enough. Survivors were staggering to their feet almost at once, and they were safely behind their own already established line. Maximus had landed heavily behind the British lines. His sides were steaming in the cold air, blood running freely from a dozen wounds and more, and his wings were drooped to the ground. He struggled to beat them again to get aloft and could not, but fell back onto his haunches, trembling in every limb. 3,000 or 4,000 men already on the ground, and 5 guns. The British troops massed here only 20,000, and most of those militia, who were plainly unwilling to charge in the face of dragons above. Many men were already trying to run. If the French commander had any sense at all, he would scarcely wait for another 3 or 4 transports to launch his own charge, and if his men overran the gun emplacements, they could turn the artillery against the British dragons and clear the approaches completely. "Lawrence," Temeraire said, turning his head around, "2 more of those vessels are going in to land." "Yes," Lawrence said low. "We must try and stop them. If they land, the battle on the ground is lost." Temeraire was quiet a moment, even as he turned his path of flight onto an angle that would bring him ahead of the leading transport. Then he said, "Lawrence, we cannot succeed, can we?" The 2 forward lookouts, young ensigns, were listening also, so that Lawrence had to speak as much to them as to Temeraire. "Not forever, perhaps," Lawrence said, "but we may yet do enough to help protect England. If they are forced to land one at a time, or in worse positions, the militia may be able to hold them for some time." Temeraire nodded, and Lawrence thought he understood the unspoken truth. The battle was lost, and even this was only a token attempt. "And we must still try, or we would be leaving our friends to fight without us," Temeraire said. "I think this is what you have meant by duty all along. I do understand. At least this much of it?"
"Yes," Lawrence said, his throat aching. They had outstripped the transports and were over the ground now, with the militia a blurred sea of red below. Temeraire was swinging about to face the first of the transports head-on. There was only just enough time for Lawrence to put his hand on Temeraire's neck, a silent communion. The sight of land was putting heart into the French dragons. Their speed was increasing. There were 2 pêcheurs at the fore of the transport, roughly equal in size, and neither injured. Lawrence left it to Temeraire to decide which would be his target, and reloaded his own pistols. Temeraire stopped and hovered in mid-air before the oncoming dragons, spreading his wings as if to bar the way. His ruff raised instinctively up, the webbed skin translucent grey in the sunlight. A slow, deep shudder passed along his length as he drew breath, and his sides swelled out even further against his massive rib cage, making the bones stand out in relief. There was a strange, stretched, tight quality to his skin, so that Lawrence began to be alarmed. He could feel the air moving beneath, echoing, resonating in the chambers of Temeraire's lungs. A low reverberation seemed to build throughout Temeraire's flesh, like a drumbeat rolling. "Temeraire!" Lawrence called, or tried to. He could not hear himself speak at all. He felt a single, tremendous shudder travel forward along Temeraire's body, all the gathered breath caught up in that motion. Temeraire opened his jaws, and what emerged was a roar that was less sound than force. A terrible wave of noise, so vast it seemed to distort the air before him. Lawrence could not see for a moment through the brief haze. When his vision cleared, he at first did not understand. Ahead of them, the transport was shattering as if beneath the force of a full broadside, the light wood cracking like gunfire, men and cannon spilling out into the broken surf far below at the foot of the cliffs. His jaw and ears were aching as if he had been struck on the head, and Temeraire's body was still trembling beneath him.
What can I do for you?
"Lawrence, I think I did that," Temeraire said. He sounded more shocked than pleased. Lawrence shared his sentiments. He could not immediately bring himself to speak. The 4 dragons were still attached to the beams of the ruined transport, and the 4 dragon to larboard was bleeding from its nostrils, choking and crying in pain. Hurrying to save the dragon, its crew cast off the chains, letting the fragment fall away, and it managed the last quarter-mile to land behind the French lines. The captain and crew leapt down at once. The injured dragon was huddled and pawing at its head, moaning. Behind them, a wild cheer was going up from the British ranks, and gunfire from the French. The soldiers on the ground were shooting at Temeraire. "Sir, we are in range of those cannon, if they get them loaded," Martin said urgently. Temeraire heard and dashed out over the water, for the moment beyond their reach, and hovered in place. The French advance had halted for a moment, several of the defenders milling about, wary of coming closer, and as confused as Lawrence and Temeraire himself were. But in a moment, the French captains above might understand, or at least collect themselves. They would make a concerted attack on Temeraire and bring him down. There was only a little time left in which to make use of the surprise. "Temeraire!" he called urgently. "Fly lower and try if you can striking at those transports from below, at cliff height." "Mr. Turner," he said, turning to the signal ensign, "give those ships below a gun and show them the signal for engage the enemy more closely. I believe they will take my meaning." "I will try," Temeraire said uncertainly, and dived lower, gathering himself and once again taking that tremendous swelling breath. Curving back upwards, he roared once again, this time at the underside of one of the transports still over the water. The distance was greater, and the vessel did not wholly shatter, but great cracks opened in the planks of the hull. The 4 dragons above were at once desperately occupied in keeping it from breaking open all the rest of the way. An arrowhead formation of French dragons came diving directly towards them, some 6 heavyweight dragons behind the Grand Chevalier in the lead. Temeraire darted away, and at Lawrence's touch dropped lower over the water, where 6 frigates and 3 ships of the line lay in wait. As they swept past, their long guns spoke in a rolling broadside, one gun after another, scattering the French dragons into shrill confusion as they tried to avoid the flying grape shot and cannonballs. "Now! Quickly! The next one!" Lawrence called to Temeraire, though the order was scarcely necessary. Temeraire had already doubled back upon himself. He went directly at the underside of the next transport in line, the largest, flown by 4 heavyweight dragons and with ensigns of golden eagles flying from the deck. "Those are his flags, are they not?" Temeraire called back. "Bonaparte is on there?"
"More likely one of his marshals," Lawrence shouted over the wind, but he felt a wild excitement anyway. The defenders were forming up again at a higher elevation, ready to come after them once more, but Temeraire beat forward with ferocious zeal and outdistanced them. This larger transport, made of heavier wood, did not break as easily. Even so, the wood cracked like the sound of pistol shot, splinters flying everywhere. Temeraire dived down to attempt a second pass. Suddenly Lily was flying alongside them, and Obvisaria on their other side. Lenton bellowing through his speaking trumpet, "Go at them! Just go at them! We will take care of those damned buggers!" And the two of them whirled to intercept the French defenders coming after Temeraire again. But even as Temeraire began his climb, fresh signals went up from the damaged transport. The 4 dragons who were carrying it together wheeled around and began to pull away, and across the battlefield all the transports still aloft gave way and turned, for the long and weary flight back in retreat to France. Epilogue.
Hello.
"Lawrence, be a good fellow and bring me a glass of wine," Jane Rowland said, all but falling into the chair beside his, without the slightest care for the ruin she was making of her skirts. "2 sets is more than enough dancing for me. I'm not getting up from this table again until I leave."
"Should you prefer to go at once?" he asked, rising. "I'm happy to take you."
"If you mean I am so ungainly in a dress that you think I cannot walk a quarter of a mile over even ground without falling down, you may say so, and then I will knock you on the head with this charming reticule," she said with her deep laugh. "I have not got myself up in this fashion to waste it by running away so soon. Exidium and I will be back at Dover in a week, and then Lord knows how long it will be before I have another chance to see a ball, much less one supposedly in our honour. I will fetch and carry with you, Lawrence. If they are not going to feed us anything more than these French tidbits, I'm going to get more of them," Chenery said, getting up from his chair as well.
"Here, here," Berkeley said. "Bring the platter."
They were parted at the tables by the crush of the crowd, which was growing extreme as the hour drew on. London society was still nearly delirious with joy over the joint victories at Trafalgar and Dover, and temporarily as happy to enthuse over the aviators as it had been to disdain them before. His coat and bars won him enough smiles and gestures of precedence that Lawrence managed to acquire the glass of wine without great difficulty. Reluctantly he gave up the notion of taking a cigar for himself. It would have been the height of rudeness to indulge while Jane and Harcourt could not. He took a second glass instead. He imagined someone at the table would care for it. Both his hands thus occupied, he was happily not forced to do more than bow slightly when he was addressed on his way back to the table. "Captain Lawrence," Miss Montague said, smiling with a great deal more friendliness than she had shown him in his parents' house. She looked disappointed to not be able to give him her hand. "How splendid it is to see you again. It has been ages since we were all together at Woollerton Hall. How is dear Temeraire? My heart was in my throat when I heard of the news. I was sure you should be in the thick of the battle, and so of course it was."
"He is very well, thank you," Lawrence said, as politely as he could manage. Dear Temeraire rankled extremely. But he was not going to be openly rude to a woman he had met as one of his parents' guests, even if his father had not yet been softened by society's new approbation. There was no sense in aggravating the quarrel, and perhaps needlessly making his mother's situation more difficult. "May I present you to Lord Winsdale?" she said, turning to her companion. "This is Captain Lawrence, Lord Allendale's son, you know," she added, in an undertone that Lawrence could barely hear. "Certainly, certainly," Winsdale said, offering a very slight nod, what he appeared to think a piece of great condescension. "Quite the man of the hour, Lawrence. You are to be highly commended. We must all count ourselves fortunate that you were able to acquire the animal for England." "You are too kind to say so, Winsdale," Lawrence said, deliberately forward to the same degree. "You must excuse me. This wine will grow too warm shortly." Miss Montague could hardly miss the shortness of his tone now. She looked angry for a moment, then said with great sweetness, "Of course. Perhaps you are going to see Miss Galman, and can bear her my greetings. Oh, but how absurd of me!"
I must say Mrs. Wolvey now, and she is not in town any longer, is she?" He regarded her with dislike. He wondered at the combination of perception and spite that had enabled her to ferret out the former connection between himself and Edith.
"No, I believe she and her husband are presently touring the Lake Country," he said, and bowed himself away, deeply grateful that she had not had the opportunity of surprising him with the news. His mother had given him intelligence of the match in a letter sent only shortly after the battle, and reaching him still at Dover. She had written after conveying the news of the engagement. "I hope what I write does not give you too much pain. I know you have long admired her, and indeed I have always considered her charming, although I cannot think highly of her judgment in this matter." The true blow had fallen long before the letter came. News of Edith's marriage to another man could not be unexpected, and he had been able to reassure his mother with perfect sincerity. Indeed, he could not fault Edith's judgment. In retrospect, he saw how very disastrous the match would have been on both sides. He could not have spared her so much as a thought for the last 9 months or so. There was no reason Wolvey should not make Edith a perfectly good husband. He himself certainly could not have, and he thought that he would truly be able to wish her happy if he saw her again. But he was still irritated by Miss Montague's insinuations, and his face had evidently set into somewhat forbidding lines. As he came back to the table, Jane took the glasses from him and said, "You were long enough about it. Was someone pestering you? Do not pay them any mind. Take a turn outside and see how Temeraire is enjoying himself. That will put you in a better frame of mind." The notion appealed immensely. "I think I will, if you will pardon me," he said, with a bow to the company. "Look in on Maximus for me. See if he wants any more dinner," Berkeley called after him. "And Lily," Harcourt said, then looked guiltily about to see if any of the guests at the nearby tables had overheard. Naturally, the company did not realize that the women with the aviators were themselves captains, and assumed them rather wives, though Jane's scarred face had earned several startled looks, which she ignored with perfect ease. Lawrence left the table to their noisy and dispirited discussion, making his way outdoors. The ancient covert near London had long ago been encroached upon by the city and given up by the corps, save for use by couriers, but for the occasion it had been briefly reclaimed, and a great pavilion established at the northern edge where the headquarters had once stood. By the aviator's request, the musicians had been set at the very edge of the pavilion, where the dragons could gather around outside to listen. The musicians had been at first somewhat distressed by the notion, and inclined to edge their chairs away. But as the evening wore on and the dragons proved a more appreciative audience than the noisy crowd of society, their fear was gradually overcome by their vanity. Lawrence came out to find the first violinist having abandoned the orchestra entirely, and playing snatches of various airs in a rather didactic manner for the dragons, demonstrating the work of different composers. Maximus and Lily were among the interested group, listening with fascination and asking a great many questions. Lawrence saw, after a moment with some surprise, that Temeraire was instead curled up in a small clearing beyond the others, off to the side, and talking with a gentleman whose face Lawrence could not see. He skirted the group and approached, calling Temeraire's name softly. The man turned, hearing him. With a start of pleasant surprise, Lawrence recognized Sir Edward Howe, and hurried forward to greet him. "I am very happy indeed to see you, sir," Lawrence said, shaking his hand. "I had not heard that you were back in London, although I made a point of inquiring after you when we first arrived." "I was in Ireland when the news reached me. I've only just come to London," Sir Edward said, and Lawrence only then noticed that he was still in travelling clothes and his boots were dust-stained. "I hope you will forgive me. I presumed on our acquaintance to come, despite the lack of a formal invitation, in hopes of speaking with you at once. When I saw the crowd inside, I thought it best to come and stay with Temeraire until you appeared, rather than try to seek you within." "Indeed, I am in your debt for putting yourself to so much trouble," Lawrence said. "I confess I have been very anxious to speak with you, ever since discovering Temeraire's ability, which I expect is the news which has brought you. All he can tell us is that the sensation is now the same as that of roaring. We cannot account for how mere sound might produce so extraordinary an effect, and none of us have ever heard of anything like." "No, you would not have," Sir Edward said. "Lawrence,
He stopped and glanced at the crowd of dragons between them and the pavilion, all now rumbling in approval at the close of the first performance. "Might we speak somewhere in more privacy? We can always go to my own clearing, if you would like to be somewhere quieter," Temeraire said. "I am happy to carry you both, and it will not take me a moment to fly there." "Perhaps that would be best, if you have no objection," Sir Edward asked Lawrence, and Temeraire brought them over carefully in his foreclaws, setting them down in the deserted clearing before settling himself comfortably. "I must beg your pardon for putting you to such trouble and interrupting your evening," Sir Edward said.
"Sir, I assure you I am very happy to have it interrupted in this cause," Lawrence said. "Pray have no concern on that score."
He was impatient to learn what Sir Edward might know. A concern over Temeraire's safety from some possible agent of Napoleon's lingered with him, perhaps even increased by the victory. "I will keep you in suspense no longer," Sir Edward said, "although I do not in the least pretend to understand the mechanical principles by which Temeraire's ability operates. The effects are described in literature, and so I may identify it for you. The Chinese, and the Japanese for that matter, call it by the name Divine Wind. This tells you little beyond what you already know from example, I am afraid, but the true importance lies in this. It is an ability unique to one breed and one breed alone. The Celestial." The name hung in silence for long moments. Lawrence did not immediately know what to think. Temeraire looked between them uncertainly. "Is that very different from an Imperial?" he asked. "Are they not both Chinese breeds?" "Very different indeed," Sir Edward answered him. "Imperial dragons are rare enough, but the Celestials are given only to the Emperors themselves or their nearest kin. I should be surprised if there were more than a few score in all the world."
"The Emperors themselves," Lawrence repeated,
in wonder and slowly growing comprehension.
"You will not have heard this, sir, but we took a French spy at the covert in Dover shortly before the battle. He revealed to us that Temeraire's egg was meant not merely for France, but for Bonaparte himself."
Sir Edward nodded. "I'm not surprised to hear as much. The Senate voted Bonaparte the crown in May before last. The time of your encounter with the French vessel suggests the Chinese gave him the egg as soon as they learned. I cannot imagine why they should have made him such a gift. They have given no other signs of allying themselves with France, but the timing is too exact for any other explanation."
"And if they had some notion of when to expect the hatching, that might well explain the mode of transport as well," Lawrence finished for him. 7 months from China to France, around Cape Horn. The French could hardly have hoped to manage it except with a fast frigate, regardless of the risk."
"Lawrence," Sir Edward said, with pronounced unhappiness, "I must heartily beg your forgiveness for having so misled you. I cannot even plead the excuse of ignorance. I have read descriptions of Celestials and seen many drawings of them. It simply never occurred to me that the ruff and tendrils might not develop save with maturity. In body and wing shape they are identical to the Imperials."
"I beg you not to refine upon it, sir. No forgiveness is called for in the least," Lawrence said. "It could scarcely have made much difference to his training, and in the event we have learned of his ability in very good time."
He smiled up at Temeraire and stroked the sleek foreleg beside him, while Temeraire snorted in happy agreement.
"So, my dear, you are a Celestial. I should not be surprised at all. No wonder Bonaparte was in such a taking to lose you."
"I imagine he will continue angry," Sir Edward said. "And what is worse, we may have the Chinese on our necks over it when they learn. They are prickly to an extreme where the Emperor's standing may be said to be concerned, and I do not doubt they will be annoyed to see a British serving officer in possession of their treasure." "I do not see how it concerns either Napoleon or them in the least," Temeraire said, bristling. "I am no longer in the shell, and I do not care if Lawrence is not an emperor. We defeated Napoleon in battle and made him fly away even though he is one. I cannot see that there is anything particularly nice about the title."
"Never fret, my dear. They have no grounds on which to make objection," Lawrence said. "We did not take you from a Chinese vessel, arguably a neutral, but from a French man-of-war. They chose to hand your egg to our enemy, and you were wholly lawful prize."
"I am glad to hear it," Sir Edward said, though he looked doubtful. "They may still choose to be quarrelsome about it. Their regard for the laws of other nations is very small and vanishes entirely where it conflicts with their own notions of proper behaviour. Pray, have you any notion of how they stand with respect to us?"
"They could make a pretty loud noise, I suppose," Lawrence said uncertainly. "I know they have no navy to speak of, but one hears a great deal of their dragons. I will bring the news to Admiral Lenton, though, and I am sure he will know better than I do how to meet any possible difference of opinion with them over the matter." A rushing sound of wings came overhead, and the ground shook with impact. Maximus had come flying back to his own clearing, only a short distance away. Lawrence could see his red-gold hide visible through the trees. Several smaller dragons flew past overhead also, going back to their own resting places. The ball was evidently breaking up, and Lawrence realized from the low-burning lanterns that the hour had grown late. "You must be tired from your journey," he said, turning back to Sir Edward. "I am once again deeply obliged to you, sir, for bringing me this intelligence. May I ask you, as a further favour, to join me for dinner tomorrow? I do not wish to keep you standing about in this cold, but I confess I have a great many questions on the subject I should like to put to you, and I would be happy to learn anything more you know of Celestials." "It will be my pleasure," Sir Edward said, and bowed to both of them. "No, I thank you, I can find my own way out," he said, when Lawrence would have accompanied him. "I grew up in London, and would often come wandering about here as a boy, dreaming of dragons. I dare say I know the place better than do you, if you have only been here a few days." He bade them farewell, having arranged the appointment. Lawrence had meant to stay the night at a nearby hotel where Captain Roland had taken a room, but he found he was disinclined to leave Temeraire. Instead, he searched out some old blankets in the stable being used by the ground crew, and made himself a somewhat dusty nest in Temeraire's arms, his coat rolled up to serve as a pillow. He would make his apologies in the morning. Jane would understand.
"Lawrence, what is China like?" Temeraire asked idly, after they had settled down together, his wings sheltering them from the wintry air.
"I have never been, my dear, only to India," he said. "But I understand it is very splendid. It is the oldest nation in the world, you know. It even predates Rome, and certainly their dragons are the finest in the world," he added, and saw Temeraire preen with satisfaction.
"Well, perhaps we may visit when the war is over and we have won. I would like to meet another Celestial some day," Temeraire said. "But as for their sending me to Napoleon, that is great nonsense. I am never going to let anyone take you from me."
"Nor I, my dear," Lawrence said, smiling, despite all the complications which he knew might arise if China did object. In his heart, he shared the simplicity of Temeraire's view of the matter, and he fell asleep almost at once in the security of the slow, deep rushing of Temeraire's heartbeat, so very much like the endless sound of the sea. Selected extracts from Observations on the Order Draconia in Europe, with Notes on the Oriental Breeds, by Sir Edward Howe, F.R.S. London, John Murray, Albemarle Street, 1796. Prefatory note from the author on the measure of